Final Fantasy IV is a landmark title for the series. This title marked the arrival of the first deeply character-driven plot of the series and the formation of the legendary ATB battle system, a battle system so good they use it for the next 5 titles in the series. It's a game that really showed what the SNES could do. The version that I played for this video was the PSP Anniversary Edition, which is no doubt the definitive version of this title. It comes bundled with the After Years game, which I won't be covering officially, as well as the PSP exclusive interlude chapter to bridge the story of the original game and the remake of the mobile episodic After Years. The graphics in this remake are gorgeous, with pixel art that oozes love and detail, as well as a reorchestrated soundtrack which only enhances the original score. There are some who would make an argument for the DS remake of the game, which is also available on Steam. However, I'm not really a fan of it. I think the 3D modelling is low poly enough to be a detriment when blown up to 1080p. And I'm not a massive fan of the voice cutscenes, even if the direction of some of the cutscenes are actually pretty good.
What's become of you? Where is the noble knight, the man who took me in as an orphan and raised me as his own? The strong, just king I once knew. Is a crystal worth all this? Robbing a peaceful people of what's theirs by right. What need could be so great?
My biggest issue with it is that you're actively encouraged to arbitrarily explore each dungeon floor to be given a bonus item, often powerful or useful ones, which means I spent most of my time in dungeons with the map overlay on the screen, and I think that's bad design personally. However, it does have some bonuses such as the harder difficulty, and it fleshes out some plot points with bonus cutscenes, so it's not an awful way to play the game, just nowhere near as good as the PSP remake in my opinion. Honestly, the only bad way to play this game is the original SNES American release, which was heavily dumbed down by stripping character abilities and lower difficulty, as well as strange censoring decisions such as scrubbing any mention of prayer. So when people pray, they hope instead, and the spell holy was renamed white. It was also named Final Fantasy II in order to not confuse the American market, since the real 2 and 3 weren't released in America, which has caused confusion to this day when talking about the series sometimes. The opening of the game is legendary. The narrative starts in media res, with our protagonist Cecil the Dark Knight coming back to his home of Baron after a raid on the mages of Mysidia for the crystal. As seen in a flashback sequence and from the talk of the troops, they found little resistance. All this is orchestrated by one heck of an opening track. The game really flexes its musical and narrative muscles right out the gate. The fact that our protagonist is feeling an emotion as complex as guilt already elevates this narrative far and away higher than any of its predecessors. Cecil delivers a crystal to his king, but his guilt gets the better of him, and he starts to question his orders, earning him a demotion to delivery boy, and another main character is introduced, Kane. He stands by Cecil and agrees to go on this journey to deliver a ring to Mist with him, as they've been friends for so long. Cecil makes towards his room for the night and runs into another main character, Sid, on the way, who in this iteration of the Sin lineage is a bit of a goofball, but still an airship engineer, as is tradition. In his room at night, Cecil stays awake questioning his actions and his place in the world, and Rosa walks in to visit him. The song known as The Theme of Love begins to play as they converse. Rosa is a white mage and her personality reflects this, with her being kind and caring for Cecil, and her empathy is a strong character trait which comes into play later in the story too. In the morning, Kane and Cecil set out and the game truly begins. This is one hell of an opening, and just this small 10-minute sequence of events demonstrates up front the difference in approach this game takes compared to the previous ones, and is a massive improvement. Getting out of Baron, you're treated to the main theme of Final Fantasy IV, and it really is truly iconic. In fact, the music in general is a massive step up from the previous games. Composer Nobuo Uematsu taking full advantage of the capabilities of the SNES. Opening the menu, you may also notice that the job system for Final Fantasy III is gone, and instead each character has their own built-in job, such as Cecil being a Dark Knight and Kane being a Dragoon. They also both start at level 10 to demonstrate that they're seasoned soldiers. The removal of the job system seems a bit disappointing at first, but the jobs often reflect who these people are as characters. Cecil's and Rose's may be being the most on the nose, but it works for the most part. It also helps with the storytelling in general. Other characters are Rydia the Summoner, Edward the Bard, Yang the Monk, and Edge the Ninja. Edge is the only one who you wouldn't quite associate his job with his personality, at least not in a stereotypical way anyway. Interestingly, there's no dedicated black mage in this game, but Rydia fills that role with her black magic to support her summoning abilities. Walking around in the world, you'll run into a random battle eventually. Battles no longer play out in rounds of turns. Instead, the active time battle system fills in an action bar, and that's when you choose a character's action. This means that battles are won not through just tactical use of your abilities, but also your dexterity navigating the menus. The monsters don't hang around for you to decide what you'll do, and they'll attack as they build up their hidden ATBs too. This makes battles in general a lot more fun, as they feel a lot busier and creates a much faster paced game, despite still being somewhat turn-based due to the way actions queue up during the battle. The difficulty can be increased significantly by selecting an active battle type, which doesn't pause the ATB bars when selecting spells, but it doesn't alleviate the action queuing that occurs within the battle engine. I would make the argument that this real-time element to the battle skews the game towards a more action focus, albeit menu-driven action. It's not fully real-time, but it's also not strictly turn-based, leaving the system in a sort of limbo that the series will later poke out either side of. The first boss fight in the game demonstrates the way the ATB system can make the fight more mechanically interesting by having a phase where if you attack during an idle phase, it will attack back in a powerful counter move. So the best way to beat it is to hold off on inputting any actions at all, and literally wait for your opportunity to strike, to instantly put in damage when it's vulnerable again. A few bosses work this way, where they can switch to different states over the course of the battle, where they gain a few new moves to attack your party with. Other bosses or powerful monsters like the Behemoth in the late game only counter-attack as their main source of damage. This creates boss fights which are mechanically rich in general, and force you to think about your tactics more than just spam your most powerful move and pray their HP falls before yours does. One example is an optional boss called Asura. She casts spells based on the head she randomly switches to, one of them being a huge heal cast on herself. The tactic I ended up using was to start the fight by casting Reflect on her, meaning that her heals were redirected to my party. Then using a tactic I saw a boss use earlier in the game, the three Major Sisters, cast Reflect on one of my team so that I cast damage spell on them to reflect into Asura through the Reflect that she had already had. The only bosses that required this much thought came very late in Final Fantasy III, perhaps arguably being only the last boss, which was one of the few bosses that I felt forced me to use magic protection spells. Don't get me wrong though, Final Fantasy IV is pretty easy. The only bosses I died to were a couple of the optional bosses because I was underleveled, and the final boss for basically the same reason. I had the tactics and gear for the final boss, but I didn't have the HP. Several characters got one shot by his big attack. The music in this game is truly legendary though, with some of the series' best music to be found here. I already mentioned the main theme, the theme of love and the opening track, but other highlights for me are the main battle theme, the boss theme, the theme for battling the elemental fiends, track called A Long Way to Go. And the Underworld theme. The game is about as linear as the last few games. There's the obvious story-related destination that gates your progress through the world, and a few distractions you can go out of your way to get to. The focus this time is very much more on the story though. The end of the first dungeon has massive story implications as it marks the true beginning of Cecil's departure from the goals of Baron. The objective he was given at the start of the game was no mere delivery job. The ring was a tool of destruction that set the whole town of Mist on fire, and killing the Eidolon also killed the summoner it was linked to, Rydia's mother. This leads to little Rydia causing an earthquake by summoning Titan in her rage, blocking the way back to Baron. The game usually railroads you in this way. For example, not long after this, when you take Rydia to Calpio to rest up, there is only one way to go, and that's forward. You can move around the desert, but the only thing you'll find is random encounters. This also happens a bit later too in the Underworld. You crash near a dwarven castle, and unlock a way to get to the next section of the game. And that next section is the only thing you can go to. You can explore the castle for some goodies, but after that you only have one way to go. I don't think this is a bad thing as it keeps the story flowing at a good pace. And luckily it's an engaging story. The story, at least for the first third or so, centers mostly around Cecil's inner struggle with finding redemption for his mistakes and rid himself of the path that he had set for himself. It's represented pretty bluntly from his class choices, starting off as a mopey, regretful warrior of dark, and unshackling himself from that and ascending Mount Ordeals to become a paladin, warrior of light. I don't think I need to explain the symbolism there. While pretty simple, it's the first for the series to have the main protagonist feel such complicated feelings and go through so much growth, especially as the last 3 games had basically none of that at all. Final Fantasy II came close by giving the protagonists a good reason to fight, but never developing them as characters. It's not just Cecil who gets the character development here though, although no one gets as much screen time devoted to their growth. For example, Teller, one of the first characters you run into. He's a hot-headed, stubborn old sage who lets his arrogance get the better of him despite his obvious wisdom. His wisdom is demonstrated early by commenting on how Rydia would become a powerful summoner one day, from the way he's seen her fight, but his bad temper and arrogance is shown with how he handles the situation with Anna and Edward. Anna reveals, as she's dying in Dancia from Baron attack, that the reason she ran was because Teller would never approve despite how much she obviously loves Edward. In a way, his hard-headedness drove her away, and now it's being paid for with her death. Edward reveals that a man named Golbez led the attack on Damcian, and Teller furiously charges out in order to pursue Golbez to enact revenge. A revenge that would cost him his life by summoning Meteor, a spell which ends up draining him of everything and only injuring Golbez. He dies feeling regret over what he's done and about his anger. Unfortunately, his is the only death that sticks. One of my pet peeves about the story in this game is how there's several instances where a main character will offer themselves up as a heroic sacrifice, only for them to still be alive afterwards. And sometimes the sacrifice makes no sense. When Yang stays behind to do something in the control panel at the Tower of Babel, I found myself asking why he did that. Like, what does him staying behind actually achieve? Not that it matters anyway, because he turns up later with the reveal that he was recovering with the Sylphs after that. There is a side quest which reveals this earlier, but I forgot to do it in this playthrough. I think the most egregious is Sid though. His noble sacrifice makes some kind of sense. The team are being chased to the upper world by the Red Wing ships, and the way to stop them would be to collapse a tunnel on the way out. Why we couldn't just throw the bomb out instead of jumping with it is beyond me, but either way, Sid takes one for the team and explodes. Literally explodes. To smithereens. But he's fine? Cecil et al. Find him on the return to the underworld recovering with the dwarves. It's like the writer of the game realised after that moment that they still needed to find a way to upgrade the ship, and without Sid it doesn't really make much sense. I don't know. One of the other issues I have with the story is the reliance on mind control for basically all the antagonists. Kane betrays the party several times due to it, to the point where I don't understand why any of the group really brought him along after this, just in case. And it turns out the big bad guy was being mind controlled and it was actually this evil alien guy behind it all along. It's a strangely cartoonish plot device that seems almost out of place. Golbez isn't really a compelling antagonist either, really. He's a bit cheesy and seems to have been loosely based on Darth Vader, mostly evident in the twist towards the end where it's revealed he's Cecil's brother. A shocking revelation that barely affects the plot outside of explaining why he doesn't finish off Cecil in the times he's had the chance. His actions are very generic bad guy stuff, including capturing Rosa to use her as a bargaining chip, and posturing in very grandstanding ways when he thinks he's on top. Which leads me to Rosa, who outside of the moment's early game, including one where she and Edward use the power of peer pressure to cure Rydia of trauma, she doesn't have much to do in the plot of Final Fantasy IV. She's very much used as a plot device more than a character, as when she's rescued for the final time, she doesn't get much more time in the spotlight. Another plot point I find a bit clumsy is that of Cecil's heritage, that he's a Luminarian as his father was one. It's revealed rather late and is a plot point that has little to do with the themes of the game. Cecil hints very early on that he doesn't know his father, and the King of Baron raised him as his own, but that's not ever really much of a point of conflict within Cecil. So this late game reveal of the identity of Cecil's father rings a bit hollow. It has no bite. It explains the voice he heard at the top of Mount Ordeals when he became a paladin, but this new information doesn't change his goals or worldview in any way really. Even the reveal that Golbez is Cecil's brother doesn't affect him much outside of him hesitating a bit more, and now fully trust Golbez now he's not mind controlled. The idea is nice, but the execution isn't all that. While the plot is far from perfect, it's very entertaining, and compared to previous games, extremely well presented. There's great uses of set pieces and story battles in order to tell the story of the game as effectively as possible. A couple of standout examples of this include when Edward plays his harp at night while mourning over Anna, and another being Edge's parents' fate as abominations, who before dying regain consciousness and say their goodbyes to him before dying. This is one of the few scenes that actually got me pretty good. I got moved a bit by this. The sprite animations are pretty limited though, and make some scenes just develop into weird pantomiming with spinning around and waving, mostly in the overly long scenes when Sid fixes up the airships. And that's Final Fantasy IV. I feel that the plot loses a lot of steam after Cecil becomes a paladin, as that was a massive character growth moment, and that is kind of it for Cecil for the rest of the game. The late game revelations don't really tease out much of a reaction out of him outside of quiet acceptance. The later parts of the game mostly just feel like busy work compared to the very story heavy start. There's still moments, some really great memorable ones, but the game sets a pace for itself early on that it just can't keep up. I only scratched the surface with the story here, so I feel like if you went on to play the game after this, even knowing what happens in a broad sense, you still find stuff to discover and enjoy. And I encourage people to play this game, no matter which way they play it. Just keep in mind the caveats I mentioned before about the Steam or DS version, although it's still a perfectly fine way to experience Final Fantasy IV. So what's left to ask is, how does this rank as a Final Fantasy game, right? Well, this is what the series is about, right? Well, to avoid having to think about it a lot later, and I feel this is the right time to start discussing it, we should ask what makes a Final Fantasy game. With 4 games in now, and even then, they're all kind of different from each other. 4 changed up the gameplay a fair bit, in order to not make the series stale, but also mixed up how leveling works in a way. With this being the first where you don't buy spells, for example. So, gameplay wise, I think the bare minimum we can say is a Final Fantasy game is an RPG where you gain levels and fight monsters, and is pretty story focused. Objectives thus far have been story related, and this will barely change as we go. Chocobos and magic and men named Sid are a staple at this point, as is that the game is a fantasy theme first and foremost, with sci-fi elements sprinkled in for good measure. Every Final Fantasy game has had this so far, even Final Fantasy I, a mix of traditional fantasy and technology. Crystals appear in each game to some capacity, and so far are linked somewhat to the themes or story of the game. For example, here the crystals were the key to unlocking Zemus from his prison, and in 3 they were the power with which the world was held in balance. And of course you have the spell names, monsters and summons recurring in each game. And I think that's about it. The trappings of Final Fantasy are mostly the story focus, aesthetics and themes. So the way battles play out, or exploration is presented, is less important to this ranking than how enjoyable the game is overall. With that said, Final Fantasy IV ranks easily on top of the previous 3 games of the series. The ATB system adds an extra layer of depth to the game, even if a lot of stuff outside of the battles are heavily simplified, like spells and abilities being learned on level ups rather than acquired elsewhere. The story is a lot better than 3's, although still rather shallow all told. Not helped by it stumbling a bit roughly halfway through. The game is fun enough that replaying the game was nowhere near a chore despite not being as customizable an experience as previous games. So the current rankings are from best to worst: 4, 1, 3 and 2. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time with Final Fantasy V.